Hi, everybody. Okay. All right. Recording in progress. My name is Jimmy. I am an alcoholic. Grateful to be alive and sober. And it's always been customary where I come from to let you know that I have a home group. It's called the Design for Living Group. I have a sponsor. I have a service sponsor. Apparently, I need a lot of adult supervision. I sponsor a lot of guys, but most importantly, I've been sober since my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was on March 28th, 1987. So, extremely grateful for this way of life. Extremely grateful for Alcoholics Anonymous, and again, thank you, Eric, for inviting me, Jeannie, for hosting a meeting, for everyone being here tonight. And how do you wind up in Mississippi? I have no idea. You know, you get a phone call. Hey, can you do a talk? Okay, I'll do a talk. And here I am in Mississippi. So I'll tell you in a general way what my life was like and how I blew up, like most of us, and how I landed in Alcoholics Anonymous. And because of a loving God and the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, my life is pretty good these days. I always like to start off by telling you that I was born perfect and I was quickly handed over to these two character defects called mom and dad. And though I make a joke about that, the truth of the matter is what I found out being around here for a little bit is that alcoholism doesn't come in a bottle. It comes in my mind, and my mind is filled with a lot of delusions about a lot of things. And one of the biggest delusions I have is nothing's my fault, you know, and it started with my parents, obviously, and it started with them and it moved through every person that was in my life, you know, or situation in my life. It's, you know, her fault, their fault, the boss's fault, the job's fault. You know, looking at myself has always been a hard task to do, but you know, I make that joke because, you know, all my parents ever try to do for me is, you know, give me a good life, give me morals, values, a good education. And, you know, what I introduced my parents to was a way of life that they never even knew existed. You know, all the goodness they ever gave me, you know, I just rolled it up into a nice ball and I stuffed it right down my parents' throats. So, you know, I grow up in northern New Jersey. I grow up on the Jersey side of the Hudson River. I live right across from Manhattan, New York City. I am 65 years old. I'm going to be 66 soon. I grow up in a very hard, tough neighborhood, a very blue collar neighborhood. I grow up in a town called Jersey City, where you know, my neighborhood, everyone's a union worker, everyone's a cop, everyone's a fireman. My dad was a butcher. You know, I never really saw a guy leave the house in a suit and jacket to go to work. That's for sure. And I grew up in a time when, you know, the only requirement for membership in my neighborhood was five or more kids. You know, and the one thing that was always at every event in my neighborhood and my family, because there was a lot of kids, there was always birthday parties and christenings and graduations, you name it. The thing that was at every event was King Alcohol. And you see, you hear that saying quite often, you know, that alcoholism is a disease of perception, you know. And again, I'm 6, 7, 8 years old. The way I look at alcohol from a young age is that alcohol equates to freedom. Alcohol equates to fun. Alcohol equates to, you know, some sort of thing that just makes everyone happy, you know. And you know, with all these parties and with all these things going on in my neighborhood, you know, I would witness that as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, you know. I got this guy called Dad. He's cunning, he's baffling, he's powerful. I live with this guy. My dad, he's a tough guy. My dad's a World War I vet. You know, he's a guy that would never sit you down and talk about his feelings. That's for sure. There would never be a fireside chat about what's going on in the family. My dad was basically a lunatic. He was an angry guy. I guess today, if we look back, he would have been 96. He probably had PTSD. I mean, he was just a guy that was wound real tight, you know. And you know, but what would happen every night at 5 o'clock is my mom would make these two pitchers, one called martinis and one called Manhattans. And what I would witness as a young kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, is the ease and comfort that comes at once by taking that first drink. Because my old man would come in the house and he'd have a drink, and all of a sudden he became a different person. He became a guy that wanted to have a catch in the backyard. He became a guy that had a kind of a sense of humor. He became a guy that was just different. Like he had the same effect that it had the effect on all of us in his room right tonight, you know. But don't let me fool you. There were those days. And those days looked something like this. My dad would come in the house huffing and puffing about something, and he'd take that drink, and then all of a sudden the kitchen plates would be flying across the kitchen. The kitchen chairs would be flying across the kitchen. If he grabbed one of us young kids, we'd be flying across the kitchen, you know. Now, none of that makes me alcoholic, but I'll tell you what happens. When my father would come in and that would go on, what me and my two brothers and my two sisters would do would we'd hide under the covers in our bedrooms, right? And we wait for that tornado to roar through their house. And then when all the anger and yelling and screaming and throwing of things just calmed down when you would walk out, and it's like, "Hey, mom, the wind stopped blowing, nothing matter here," like all of a sudden, we never talked about what just went on in my house. So from a young age, and none of that makes me alcoholic, but from a young age, I'm a kid that grows up with a tremendous amount of fear. Loud noises, yelling, screaming, I'm like a clam, I just shut down. I'm a kid that I grow up with a lot of insecurity about myself and the way I feel about a lot of things. But worst of all, I grow up with a kid with a lot of secrets. You see, if you come from my family and you come from my neighborhood, you never talk about what's going on in your house. You never talk about what's going on in your neighborhood. So from a young age, I internalized my feelings. I pushed down all this stuff, all this anger, rage, fear, all this insecurity. And, I just thought that's the way life was supposed to be. But at the age of 13 years old, that moment happened, and I think we all have a moment, and the moment might be a big deal, it might be a little deal. I think mine's kind of a little deal, but the moment was I was in fifth grade, and I was in a public school system, and not seeing that my parents wanted the best for me, they pulled me out of the public school system and they brought me across town to the Catholic school. And they put me into a Catholic school where I knew nobody. Now, when I was in that public school system, having friends, playing ball, doing all the things that, 10, 11, 12-year-olds do, there was a sense of, easiness. There was a sense of okayness inside of me. But when my parents brought me to that Catholic school system, the first thing I met was these things called nuns, and they were cunning, baffling, and powerful in their own way, but I was with new kids. I was like that square peg in a round hole. We hear that all the time. But I'm 13 years old, and I'm and I'm with these new kids. And what happened this particular night was my first drink. It was 53 years ago. I can remember it like it happened this afternoon. And I'm in a cemetery of five guys that I still know to this day. And here comes that first bottle. It's called Colt 45 malt liquor. And I put my hand in there with a lot of fear because I don't know what's going to happen if I start drinking alcohol. And I start drinking on that beer. And here comes that second bottle. It's called Mohawk Blackberry Brandy. And I start drinking on that blackberry brandy. And I'll tell you what happened on my first night drinking. I blacked out. I puked purple for about 2 weeks. My father gave me a beating of my life. My mother grounded me for apparently forever. But the hook was in. I found that magic elixir, that thing that just settled down, that everything that was inside of me. And I'm not even sure what all those things were inside of me. I just know that there was a tightness, there was a thing about me that I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it. But when King Alcohol hit my system, all of a sudden bets are off. And what happened to me was basically I just stepped on a path that goes straight to pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization because the next 16 years of my life, full blown alcoholism and homelessness on the streets of northern New Jersey became the way of life. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of drunken log stories, but, you know, uh, my drinking became progressive, so did my behavior. You see, I grew up in an age when, my mom and dad would open up the door, or really my mother would open up the door and we would, she'd kind of like boot us out, 8 o'clock in the morning. She knew you'd come home sooner or later, but it was a safe time living on the streets, hanging out on the streets. And like I say all the time, hanging on the streets, living on the streets, you learn a lot of things about the streets, and you learn about a lot of things that are criminal in nature, and all of a sudden, the people that were really important in my life, like my older brothers and my uncles and stuff like that, they weren't that important. The people that started to become really important in my life were the older guys in the bars, the guys that were hanging on the corners, the guys that were in the schoolyard. The most important guy I thought in the neighborhood was the neighborhood bookie. I mean, he had a nice car. He always had a good-looking girl on his arm. He always had a wad of cash in his pocket. That was someone I wanted to be inspired to. So this is just the way I'm growing up early on, living on the streets, doing little petty crimes, doing little things that, it's not like my parents ever sat me down and said, this is how you rob a car or anything like that. But with my drinking, everything started to become very progressive. My parents wanting the best for me and always wanting to give me a good education, always put me after grammar school, they put me into a Jesuit college, Jesuit high school. I was always surrounded with religious people. I was always surrounded with priests and nuns in my life. It just became a way of life, and they were really family friends to my parents all the time. But I'll tell you just a little story about me. In New Jersey back then, the drinking age was 18 years old. And if your chin could hit a bar, you were getting served by 15 or 16 in every bar. You know, uh, it would be very easy to go into an old man's bar and just start, ordering a drink. As long as you had money, they would serve you, and so I'm an everyday drinker by the time I'm 17, 18 years old, and I'm not drinking to get loaded every day. The alcoholic life seems the normal one. Doesn't this what everyone does? Have a few beer at lunch, have a few beers after school, sneak a few beers at night. I just thought this was a normal way of living. But the best story I could tell you, it's not the best story, but the story I want to tell you is about the story in high school when I was confronted by a priest over my drinking. And we got a kind of a shouting match, and all of a sudden I knocked this priest out. Now, a lot of people go, ooh, like that. And I'm like, okay, I didn't go to hell right away, but I knocked this priest out. And I tell you that for a reason, because it earmarks a spot in my life. It earmarks a spot in my life when I realized, looking back, whenever I was faced with anything in my life, any tough time, any situation in my life, or any person that I had a problem with, I either got angry at it or I drank at it. And that way, it just became a way of life with me. At 17, 18 years old, I became my father. And I was an angry kid. I was an angry guy. And that was the way my life was for a long period of time. I got out of high school and eventually went on to college. I'd like to tell you that I spent at least 4 years in college. I spent around 6 months in college before I got thrown out of college because I couldn't stop drinking. I had the inability to stop drinking. So I come home to New Jersey, and what's a guy to do? I have no trade, I have no education, I don't have a hook to get a union job. And by the time I'm 20 years old, going down to the corner bar to try to figure out my life just becomes a way of life. Going down to the corner bar and trying to think of what I'm going to do in my life. And there's a problem with that. And the problem is that I take that first drink on a daily basis. And see, when I take that first drink, all bets are off, and I didn't understand that until I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. And even when I was in AA and I would hear things like the first drink gets you loaded, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard in my life. I always thought it was the last 20, the outside issues. I mean, I always had excuses why. But the first drink was getting me drunk every day, and I didn't understand why, with all the goals, the dreams, the aspirations that we all have, and I wanted to be something. I wanted to do something in my life. But by the time I'm 20 years old, I'm just in a corner bar every day. And that day would look like most days, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm going to go home, but I never go home. 5 o'clock, I have a bag on. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 2 o'clock, it closes. Off to New York City for the after hours bars. And that cycle, that vicious cycle that I was trapped in was just on and on and on. No idea about a physical allergy, no idea about the phenomena of craving. All my problems were external. It was your fault, her fault, Jeannie's fault, Eric's fault. It was everyone else's fault for the way I felt deep down inside. And my life was all twisted up, kind of a double-edged sword guy where everything is their fault or someone else's fault, but there's also a side of me that's always searching and seeking something out there to make myself feel better in here. And whether that's drinking, drugs, money, cars, women, you name it, I was always on the search for something. There has to be a magic potion that's out there that's going to make me feel okay inside here. So when I was about 25 years old, I met this woman in a bar, obviously, my sister introduced me to this girl, and, I'm under this delusion. Again, this alcoholism is nothing more than a delusion of the mind. And this delusion is that if I just get married, settle down, because all the guys around me seem to be doing that. They seem to be getting careers. They seem to find that woman. They seem to buy a house. They seem to be, having kids. They seem to be happy, joyous, and free. And I'm stuck in that bar on a daily basis. So I meet this woman, and 4 months into the marriage, what I realize is I have the inability not to take that first drink. I'm powerless, but I don't know those words. I don't know that until I land in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm in this marriage. I can't stop drinking. We're fighting all the time. And I do what most cowards do. I walked out of the marriage after 4 months. I'm 25 years old. I'm 26 years old around. And I walk out of this marriage and I flatten this woman. I leveled her with my behavior. And I took off for a place called Boca Raton, Florida, where I had a couple of friends and a family friend that had a lot of money. And I'm drinking around the clock. I'm 25, 27 years old. I can't even remember the age, but I'm drinking around the clock. And, I got that guilt, that shame, that remorse. I'm getting that knock at the door every day, the four horsemen of terror, frustration, bewilderment, despair showing up. I got every emotion that Bill talks about, every character defect going on in my life, but I'm still under the delusion that drinking's not even a problem. Now, a blind man can see that drinking's a problem. But here I am, I'm down there, and somewhere along the lines, I swear that God just cracked my skull open, and in my skull, he put this chalkboard. And in this chalkboard, there was these three emotions of, shame, guilt, and remorse. And it seems to me that everything that went on to my life up to this moment created some sort of shame. Shame of not being a good child, a good son, a shame of not being a good brother, shame of failing out of school, shame of losing jobs, shame of walking out of marriage, shame, 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 shame. Most alcoholics have shame-based identities. Not only that, the guilt of the people I was hurting and the remorse of all the, I wasn't raised to be an animal, but I was an animal. So here I am, I'm down in Boca Raton, and I'm getting that knock every day, and I still got this solution. It's called Johnny Walker Red, and I'm at this point in my drinking where I just need to crack the seal of a bottle, because I know when I do take that first drink, all that grandiosity is going to come back. And when it does, what do I do? Well, what I always do, it's your fault. It's our fault. It's everyone else's fault. I can't take stock honestly of my life. I have to blame someone for the way I feel inside. So what happens to me is, I burned a lot of bridges. I'm riddled with this shame, and I decide to come back to New Jersey. I'm 27 years old, and I'm afraid to call my family. I'm afraid to call the wife in limbo, whatever you want to call her at that point. And I make a decision, and the decision is to live on the streets of northern New Jersey. And for the next 19 months of my life, I lived homeless on northern New Jersey and lower Manhattan. We have the train station that goes between New York and New Jersey, and I would jump the turnstile. I'd be in a city panhandling. I'd be stealing. I'd be robbing. My life just became very traumatic and very dehumanizing. I mean, if you lived one night on the street, you know that one night's too many. I mean, it's a different way of life when you live on the streets. And I did things I swore I would never do. I had things happen to me I swore that would never happen. My life was basically, but I always like to say, if I took a basketball, let's just say, and it was made of glass, and I just dropped it, I mean, it would shatter. And basically, at the age of 27 years old, my life was shattered in every direction. I had no direction, really. And I'm dying of this thing called alcoholism, and I don't even know it. That's the power of this thing. I think that everything is, again, I hate to harp on this, but I think everything is an external problem. I have no idea about this thing called alcoholism. Never heard of words like sobriety or Alcoholics Anonymous or recovery or anything like that. So I'm just walking the streets. I'm putting my head down wherever I could put my head down. I'm selling blood whenever I could sell blood. I'm doing all the things that we do when you live on the streets. And I walk in a bar one day, and I see a guy in a bar that I knew, and he came up to me. He was an older guy, and he said, "Jimmy, they're hiring guys like you in Newark Airport. Guys like us. They were hiring guys like us." There used to be an airline called People's Express that eventually became Continental, then United. And back then, People's Express would hire guys like us to take the luggage that was over there and hopefully get it on the plane that's over there. And so he would tell us, this guy told me that they're hiring, and all you need to do is go out to the airport and do a little interview, and you'll probably get the job, because they need people. So that next day, me and two guys, we robbed a car and we went out to Newark Airport. All three of us are now sober over near all 37 years sobriety, all of us. Quite comical amends to the guy that we robbed the car off. He's still a good friend of ours. But we go out to Newark Airport that next day, and I'm a mess. And the interview process looks something like this. You would walk in the room, and you can imagine the size of an airport. I mean, it's huge, Newark Airport. It's a huge, big international airport. There's people everywhere. There's things, activity. There's a lot going on. And we walked in this room, and the guy basically just said, "Can you lift the suitcase?" "Yeah, okay, then you got the job," and that was the job. And I want to tell you about that day, because what happened to me was, after this guy just talked to me for a little while, I mean, he was shaking his head looking at me, but I walked out of that room and I sat down in a metal chair or chair out in the general area of the airport. And for years, I couldn't tell you how I felt. For years, I couldn't put words to that moment until I landed into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it wasn't until I picked up that blue book and I turned to page 8 and I read Bill's story. And when Bill talks about his first step experience, I think he puts words to all our first step experience when he says, "No words could tell no words could tell the loneliness and despair I felt in the bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I met my match. I've been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master." And at the age of 29 years old, sitting in that airport with the wind blowing through the hole in my soul, I think drinking's a problem. This is my first admission. I think maybe, just maybe, that drinking's a problem. And again, a blind man can see that. Within about 3 or 4 minutes, a complete stranger sat next to me. And the stranger, after a little bit, looking at me, he said, "What's your problem?" Now, people weren't asking me how my 401k was doing or how my children were doing or anything of goodness was doing. This gentleman looked at me and said, "What's your problem?" And for whatever reason, well, I know it's really the grace of God, I spit up my life story on this guy in about 10 minutes. And he looked at me and goes, "Where do you live?" I said, "Wherever I could put my head down." He asked me a question that I thought was quite odd at the time. He says, "Is it possible for you not to take a drink the rest of this day?" And I was honest with him. I said, "I want to drink right now." It was like 10 o'clock in the morning. He said, try not to take a drink today and be at this address." And he pulled out a piece of paper. This is pre-cell phone, pre-beeper days. And he wrote down a street. He said, "You know where this is?" I said, "That's my old neighborhood." And he put a number in front of that street, and said, "Be there at 7 o'clock tonight." And at 7 o'clock that night, I'm standing in front of that address. Delusional, out of my mind, really. My knees are knocking, my stomach's churning, my mind's like, was I even in Newark Airport today? I mean, I was in really rough, bad shape. But for whatever reason, I'm standing at that address at 7 o'clock that night when all of a sudden a 1979 Chevy Impala pulled up. And that Chevy was being driven by that stranger. And in that car, there was a few other strangers that I'd never met before. And when they rolled up on me, they rolled that window down and they said, "That most spiritual thing you'll ever hear in Alcoholics Anonymous, get in the car." And I got in the car with these gentlemen and they took me around the corner to my grammar school, where for years I thought it was bingo, but who knew? It was AA. And they walked me into my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was on March 28th, 1987. And see, walking into grace doesn't feel like walking into grace. It felt like I was just walking out of complete chaos. I had no idea of the enormity of what I was about to walk into. I had no idea what alcohol. I never even know what alcohol. I didn't even know it when I was standing in the room that night. I had no idea what Alcoholics Anonymous was. But I walked down those stairs in my grammar school. And I had all these recollections of when I was in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. I remember passing that cafeteria. I looked in that cafeteria. I remember I was a kid that had goals and dreams and aspirations. I wanted to do something. I didn't want to be a union worker. I don't know why that was so bothersome to me, but I wound up being a union worker anyway. I wanted something good in my life. I was just tired of all the nonsense and the stuff in my house and my old man. And I just wanted to be free. But here I am walking down a hallway into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, when at the end of that hall, I met the most important person you'll ever meet. We called him the greeter. And that gentleman put his hand out to me, and I grabbed that flimsy reed, and he pulled me into you. Today, I know that's the loving and powerful hand of God that was in that moment. And that gentleman gave me something that I think we're all responsible to give. And he gave me a piece of dignity that night, because he didn't judge me. He didn't care that I smelled. He didn't care that every other word was a profanity. He said, "Hey, kid, just come in. Sit up front. Grab a cup of coffee. It's easier if you sit up front, because then you can hear what the speaker is going to say." And that was my day. That was my introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. And that stranger became my sponsor that night. And that group was a young people's group. I was 29 years old, and I was the youngest guy in the group that night. And that became my home group. So on day one, I had a sponsor and I had a home group, and it took away the interview process, I guess. I had no idea what either or meant, but I was part of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's unbelievable how I can remember those first week of my recovery so long ago. Because you see, these men that I got around that night, they were kind men. They were really old. They were like 45 years old. I'm 29, they're 45, but it's a different generation. These guys already had careers. These guys already had families. These guys already had, kids and jobs and all that stuff. And what I like to say is it's the kindness of strangers that got me into Alcoholics Anonymous and kept me in Alcoholics Anonymous. Because what these men did, it wasn't like we were speaking about the book back then. We didn't talk about the book like we do today. I mean, my home group today is a 300-person home group on every Sunday night. We're a big book study. But back then, it was speaker meetings, it was discussion meetings. We didn't really talk about, the literature so much, maybe the 12 and 12, So, So these guys, they just surround, I used to say they didn't know the difference between a phone book and a big book, but I'll tell you what they did. If you needed help, they'd be on your front door. And what these men did for me was that first night, they put me up in a motel for a week. They went to a department store and bought me clothes. They bought me sneakers, jeans, t-shirts. On day two, they came to get me to bring me, they came to bring me to a meeting. And I did something that was very odd. I shared an emotion. Now you might be saying to yourself, Jim, what are you talking about? Shared an emotion. You see, I'm a guy from the streets. I don't talk about stuff that's going inside. I live under that John Wayneism, that code, like real men don't share their pain, real men don't talk about how they feel, real men don't cry, all that crap. And that's how I was. But on this particular day, this guy Richie pulled up and I told him, hey, Richie, man, I'm scared. He goes, why are you scared? I said, I want to drink. And what I witnessed that day was what a trusted servant in Alcoholics Anonymous does. He called up his wife and said, take me off the calendar. He brought me to 3 meetings that day. He fed me 3 times. I probably drank 100 cups of coffee that day, but I felt like I was a part of something at last. Day 7, I'm in my home group with my new sponsor, all these new people. I still don't know what's going on. I'm going to use an old term, AA term. You guys might know it down in Mississippi, but I was mocus. I was like shot out, as they say. I still don't know what's going on. My head is in the clouds, and we're at this my new home group, and we're going to have a business meeting, and that's exciting, a business meeting. And this guy Richie comes up to me and goes, I want you to take the job as the ashtray cleaner. And I'm like, you're out of your mind. I didn't say that to him, but in my head I said, you're out of your mind. And I had a perfectly good reason. Why would I clean ashtrays? To this moment, I have never smoked a cigarette in my life, so why do I have to clean ashtrays? And what I didn't understand, that this gentleman was trying to get me tethered to Alcoholics Anonymous through a commitment. He wanted me to have a job, so I have a responsibility, so I could show up on a weekly basis and do the job. And I got to tell you what happened. I said, yes, I'll do it. I listened to that small voice within. That small voice within said, hey, this dude's just trying to help you. Trust this guy. He's trying to help you. And I said, yeah, I'll clean ashtrays. And what I could tell you is from that moment on day 7 to this moment right now, 36 and a half years later, I've been tethered to Alcoholics Anonymous through a commitment. Whether it's through a home group, my district, my area, I've been involved in the service of the third legacy of Alcoholics Anonymous, and been very involved in a lot of different things. But that really starts my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous. My life got really good really quick. I bounced back immediately, really fast. My health came back. Back then, the old timers really hammered you on going to the doctor, going to the dentist, taking care of your health. You've been out on the streets a long time. A lot of the guys I grew up with, a lot of the guys I hung out with, all wound up with HIV or Hep C. A lot of them died, from HIV. They were all intravenous drug users. So there was a lot of things going on, but these old timers would be on top of us saying, you need to take care of your body, you need to take care of your health, and more importantly, you need to take care of your mind and spirit through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. So, I got back with that wife, believe it or not. I have these 2 little AA babies. Life looks great. I got a job. I got a really good job, really. And, to the outside looking in, you would say, Jimmy, you're really successful. You're doing really good. But at 5 years without a drink, I got a rope. I'm just looking for a bridge to jump off. And why I say this, because I'm dying of something I didn't even know I was dying from. I'm dying of something we weren't even talking about. I'm dying of this thing called untreated alcoholism. I'm physically sober. I'm under the delusion that abstinence is a solution to a spiritual malady, but I'm dying in the rooms because you see, I'm still that 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 13-year-old kid walking around with a belly full of fear, a belly full of insecurity, a belly full of secrets. I'm physically sober. I'm not drinking and going to meetings, and we all know that's important, but I'm not changing. And at 5 years without a drink, I'm doing a talk in this town, and I'm lying to everyone because I'm paralyzed by what you think of me. And I'm talking about God like I have a relationship with God. I don't. I read the 12 and 12. I know some jokes. I could, and at the end of the meeting, the line comes up. They're shaking your hand. Thanks for speaking. And this guy walks up to me, and I'm 6'4". He's 6'4", and he looks at me eyeball to eyeball. Goes, "You're screwed." A little saltier language, and I want to start a fist fight in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous because I don't know how to face confrontation without conflict or violence. Really, I don't know how to face resistance with no resistance. And I wanted to start a fight with this guy, but I take a step back and I look at this gentleman. I said, "You're right. I need help." And that next day, I found myself in his railroad room apartment in northern New Jersey. And this guy's giving me the spiritual test, maybe a test that you've been given once or twice in your life. And what happened was I'm sitting in this apartment and he's peppering me with some questions. First question he says to me is, Jim, how long could you hold your breath? How long can you hold your breath? How long can you be in a 12-step program and not work the 12 steps? Apparently 5 years. What's your relationship with God look like? Well, I believe in God, I'm a Catholic, but what does God really have to do with this? He asked me, the next question was, what makes you alcoholic? And the best I could stammer out of my mouth is, I drink too much. I had no idea about the physical allergy. I had no idea about the phenomenon called craving. I had no idea about the mental obsession. We weren't talking about that stuff. The talks around my way or my neighborhood back then was of, a guy would come or a commitment would come and you'd hear 30 minutes of drunken log and then 5 minutes of maybe my life is great today. We weren't breaking down the book like we do today, and and then he just kind of gave me a consideration. Well, before he even said that, he asked me a question that sometimes people don't even believe, but he looked at me and said, where's your big book? And I asked him, what's a big book? 5 years active in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I'm sure there was a book at a podium. I'm sure there was a book at a literature table. But again, we weren't encouraged to read that book or even open that book. It wasn't until 1991 when Joe and Charlie came through the Northeast, Harlem, New York specifically, where all of a sudden the language of recovery through the 12 steps and the book Alcoholics Anonymous really started to come alive in my neighborhood. And, so that started to change the way we looked at a lot of things. But the last thing this gentleman asked me was, Jim, if AA works, why do you have so many problems? Well, the truth of the matter is, I'm not working Alcoholics Anonymous. Again, I have fallen under that delusion that abstinence is the solution to the problems I suffer from. So what happened on this particular day is my life changed. My life drastically changed. And what happened was this guy, Bill, his name was Bill Grace. He came from St. Paul, Minnesota, the same place my sponsor comes from today, ironically, you know. This guy, Bill Grace, walked into my town. He had a blue book under his arm. He was a man with what depth and weight. He was armed with the facts about himself. He carried this message. The old timers would have business meetings in my home group, and they would say, stay away from that guy because they felt threatened by his sobriety. As crazy as that sounds. But what this guy did is he sat me down on this particular day and he started to talk about the two goals of Alcoholics Anonymous. Two goals I kind of try to believe in today. The first goal is the obvious one. Don't pick up the first drink. But the second goal is the goal we all want to attain. And that goal is to step into the sunlight of the spirit, to have a spiritual awakening, to have a psychic change, personality change, whatever you want to call it. I like to sit with the guys downstairs in my house at the kitchen table, and there's a beautiful day. I live on the Jersey Shore. It's beautiful. I live right on the ocean. Gorgeous, right? A little cold today, but I always tell them, when I sit at that table, I said, see that glass door at the end of my hallway? You walk out that door, you're walking into the sunlight of the spirit. But in order to walk out into the sunlight of the spirit, you got to do something that's very different. You got to walk into the darkness of your life, right? And that's what this guy, Bill Grace, said to me. You have to walk into the darkness of your life. See, spirituality isn't about avoiding my problems. Spirituality is about attacking my problems. And what I started to understand is that I have to start taking these steps. There's a book we have in our conference-approved book called The Daily Reflections. Probably you guys are all familiar with that book. And if you turn to May 1st and look at that second paragraph, one of the most powerful readings I've ever read is in that book. It says, it's the side of myself that I refuse to look at that rules me. I must be willing to look at the dark side in order to heal my mind and my heart, because that's the road to freedom. I must walk into darkness to find the light, and walk into fear to find peace. And the way the old timers used to say that in my neighborhood was that Alcoholics Anonymous is like a big bonfire. And a lot of people are walking around the fire, but eventually the fire is going to die. If you really want to change, if you really want to grow, if you really want to have an experience, you need to walk through that fire and get your ass burnt and feel the uncomfortability of change. And see, I was at that place in my life, or that place in my sobriety, where I was willing to go to any length now. I was willing to get rid of the stuff that was inside of me because I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so we sat at that kitchen table and he started to open up that doctor's opinion. We were talking about that first step. I live Silkworth is right here. His gravesite is right by my house, right? Dr. William D. Silkworth. And I can't tell you how many times I've passed that cemetery when I'm passing that cemetery, especially when the weather is nice, and I look in that cemetery, Glenwood Cemetery, and I look in there, and what do I see? I see you guys. I see two people with beach chairs, folding chairs, and what I witness is one drunk talking to another, explaining our first step experience, all through our first step experience about this phenomena called craving, everything that Silkworth talks about. But more importantly, what he says is that there's very little hope for my recovery unless I have a psychic change. And I started to understand that. Through my own story, I started to understand that every time I picked up that drink, I couldn't stop drinking. I had no power, choice, and control in my body. And I certainly had no power, choice, and control in my mind prior to that drink. Because how many times did I say to myself, I'm not drinking today, and I'm drinking today? How many times did I say to myself, I'm only going to have one or two, go watch the ball game, go watch halftime, and go home and sleep, and I'd be out for 2 or 3, 4 days at a clip. So I started to understand just through my own story what step one was all about, the powerlessness of that. And we started to talk about step two, and I started to understand something that he said to me that I thought was a little confusing, but now I look at it, now true it is. Nowhere in our literature does it say anything about AA getting us to quit drinking. Our first 4 chapters say the complete opposite. You can't quit drinking. Lack of power is your dilemma. You have no mental defense against that first drink. And I started to understand that I can't get me sober. I can't get anyone sober, and I can't get anyone drunk. And the chapter we agnostics was the wake up call. Because what we know and what I know is that AA is really designed to awake us to the great reality, to a God of our understanding, to have this psychic change, to have this personality change. Because without that, there's very little hope for my recovery. And I understood it on a level that I never knew before. And as I did that third step with this gentleman and got on my knees, really the decision was, yeah, God, to turn my will and my life over to care of God. But really the decision for me was to walk into that hallway and do something that I had never thought I'd be able to do. And I thought was a weakness at one point, was to be vulnerable to another man, to share my life with another man, a sponsor. And when I got off my knees, I made that decision to walk into the darkness of my life, to uncover, discover, and discard the things that are blocking me from God, and more importantly, blocking me from you. I have built a lot of walls around me through the years, the walls of alibis, the walls of excuses. There's always been a thing between me and you and me and God. Old timers used to say this all the time, that alcoholism is nothing more than a soul sickness caused by a separation from God and a disconnect from each other. That's why I walk around and I'm so isolated, and that's why I don't talk to anyone. That's why I don't share anything. That's why it's me on me. It's always me on me. Living life on Jimmy's terms, and all that has ever created in my life is just a lot of conflict, pain, suffering. So I was willing to go in. I was willing to go in and look at the common manifestations of living a life on self-will, all the anger I had, all the rage I had. I started to get that down on paper. I started to look at all these fears. I'm a tough guy from the streets. I'm not afraid of anything. Well, that's not the truth. I'm afraid of everything. And I didn't know that. So I started to get that out of my mind and get it on paper. I had to start looking at all the harm I caused. I had to start looking at all the unhealthy dependencies that I put on people, especially women. If you did something for me, then I felt good about me. I mean, what a way to live, and putting these unreal expectations on everyone in my life, being the director of life, and then more importantly, what I really had to look at is the 19 months of living a life on the streets. That almost killed me. That was traumatic. And I really had to take a good look at that, with the help of a sponsor. And I'll tell you, I went for that long talk. I had the most unbelievable day of my life, that first original fifth step. I've done many since, but that first one, I think that's the story of all of us. That first one where we're willing to just unburden what we're holding on to and share it with another person. And it was a long talk, like it says. And at the end of that talk, I took that hour. I didn't go home and put the book on a shelf and take it off the shelf. I went to a place called Liberty State Park. Liberty State Park is on the Hudson River overlooking Manhattan. And I'll never forget this day. I walked out on this pier and I sat down on this pier. I opened up the book to page 75. I read those the first five proposals, all the stones properly in place, all the questions it asked us. And all of a sudden I started to cry. I started to cry. I started to cry because there was a sense of freedom that I felt. And when I looked to my right, less than a quarter mile to my right was the Statue of Liberty. When I looked across the Hudson River, right in front of me was the World Trade Center, the two towers. When I looked to the left of me was Ellis Island, these symbols of freedom. And here I sat as a 32-year-old man with tears coming down my eyes, and I could feel the arms of God wrapped around me for the first time in my life. And for the first time in my life, I felt okay. Now, okay was a big deal. Okay was a big deal, you know. But then I fell for that biggest trap that we all fall for. Not we all, but a lot of people fall for. I fell prey to comfortability. Because even though I did that fifth step, and even though I did some amends, you know, other things started to become important. I'm back with the wife. I got the kids, coaching baseball, coaching basketball, going to my daughter's swim meets, doing all the things that we get to do. You know, thank God we get to do that stuff. But that became my primary, that overtook my primary purpose. And all of a sudden, very quickly, my life started to go down. You know, I live on the ocean right here. If I take the boat out on the ocean, I've got to tell you guys, every day, well, now it's about 7:15 every morning, you're on that ocean, right? You can see the curvature of the earth and the sun rises. It's the most spectacular thing you'll ever see in your life, well, for me anyway. And I could stare at that sun coming up every day, you know. But what recovery is, it's like I'm drifting. And see, I'm in that boat and I'm looking at the sun, but I don't see that I'm drifting from town to town to town. And all of a sudden, before you know it, I'm in trouble again in my recovery. And at 10 years of sobriety, without, you know, going into a big story here, I blow up my life in Alcoholics Anonymous. I walk out of my marriage, I blow up that. I'm the guy that builds a beautiful spiritual structure up for me and my family, and I tear it down with a senseless series of sprees. And you don't need to be drinking to blow up your life in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's for sure. Just sponsor a lot of people, you'll find that out. And I'm living this double life again in Alcoholics Anonymous. How'd that happen? How'd I have that moment at 5 years, and then all of a sudden at 10 years, I'm disconnected again from God, from you, giving my sponsor about 30% what's going on. I'm living this double life, doing things I never thought I'd do. And by the time I'm 13 years sober, I'm getting thirsty again. You know, 13 years without a drink, you know, or 13 years sober, I walk into a bar one night. I understand what Dr. Bob talks about when he says he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? I didn't want to drink, but man, I needed to drink because the pain was so great, or the way I was living my life again. And I walked into this bar and I ordered a drink, and it was like the devil and the angel popped out on my shoulder. Drink it, don't drink it, drink it, don't drink it. And I don't know, it was almost like I was in a blackout. I'm staring at that drink when all of a sudden a hand went around that glass and pulled it back. And when I looked up, the bartender just happened to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said to me, "What are you doing?" Apparently throwing my life away. And what happened to me is I took my tail, I put it between my legs, and I left that bar. And 2 weeks later, I'm in a meeting where I'm hearing this guy speak. And I'll just show you the power of the ego. 2 weeks earlier, I want to drink. 2 weeks later, I'm in this meeting. This guy's doing a workshop, and I'm judging this guy because he sounds too good to be true. But that gentleman that night became my sponsor for the next 17 years. And to make this story a lot shorter, he brought me through the steps. He, you know, basically I just recreated my life all over again, you know, and went through a divorce, went through a lot of things, you know, a lot of adversities in my life, just like many of us, you know. Being sober and being a member of Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't keep you problem proof. That's for damn sure, as most of you might know, you know. So, you know, I go through the steps, I go through a lot of things, and, you know, my life's just got better and better and better, you know. But adversity hit, you know. I'm 18 months sober. I forgot to even mention this, you know, and there was times in my sobriety when you know, is there really a God that can help a guy like me? Is there really a God? And does God hear my prayers? I'm 18 months sober. I'll never forget this day. I walked into a bar one day. I mean, I walked into my parents' house and I found my father dead. My father was dead on the floor. Now I'm doing a lot of 12-step calls back in those days. That was very common back in my neighborhood, you know. So I'm very well versed in the art of going on to a house and doing a 12-step call. So I'm in there and I call my sponsor. He goes, "Let's pray and let's call 911." I call 911 and, you know, we're praying. All of a sudden, the first cop shows up. He's taking the information down. He looks at me and goes, "I don't see you walking the streets anymore." I said, "Yeah, I don't do that anymore." Taking a little bit more information down, he goes, "Matter of fact, I don't even see you drinking in bars anymore." I said, "Yeah, I don't do that anymore either." Well, he goes, "How do you do that?" I said, "Well, I go to this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous, and apparently it's working." And I wound up 12-stepping that cop over my dead father's body. And I tell you this for a reason. About 8 months ago, 7 months ago, I'm in my home group huge. Like I said, big home group, 300 people every Sunday night. And I get a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, it's the cop who's now retired, and he's been looking for me. And he came to the meeting, he found out where my home group was. He came to find me to let me know that that night he was celebrating 34 years of sobriety, that he was sober from the day that I met him over my dead father's body. Now, I don't tell you that for applause. I don't tell you that for any reason, because I can't get him drunk. I mean, I couldn't get him sober. I can't get him drunk, right? I tell you that for a reason, that God will use you without your permission, even in the hardest of times. And one of the first spiritual truths I've ever learned was that in order to get out of the darkness of my life, I need to serve others. So this life of service has been something that has really gone on for a long period of time, of carrying a message to the alcoholic who still suffers. And we do that in a lot of different ways. So, adversity hits, 1999, I'm on the job and I'm in a horrific accident. Horrific. I've had 41 surgeries in the last 21 years, I guess. I've had 12 back operations. I've had 3 knee replacements, 3 shoulder replacements. I'm really 5'8", but after they put all the metal in me, I'm 6'4". It's a miracle. But the truth of the matter is, I've been through the ringer like many of us too. So I've gone through that. I've gone through divorce. COVID hit, and as you guys know, the world turned upside down. My mom was living with us. She was really suffering bad from dementia. We couldn't handle it no more. I became the parent to my parent. That's a weird thing altogether. And so we had to put my mom away. My mom had a knee replacement at 90 years old. My mom was a Jane Fonda workout freak. She was always in shape. It's bizarre when they even say that. But at 90 years old, the doctor says she needs a knee replacement. We're like, what are you, crazy? He says, she's in better shape than all you kids. So my mom had a knee replacement. And when that happens, when a person at all goes under anesthesia, dementia could be a real problem. And my mom it really catapulted her dementia so bad that we couldn't even take care of her anymore. We put her in assisted living, and COVID hits, and the whole joint gets COVID, and a lot of them died, and my mom was one of them. And I tell you this for a reason. How many meetings have I been to? How many conferences have I been to? How many Zoom talks have I been to? How many times have I heard the evidence of the power of God and power of Alcoholics Anonymous come from other people who have gone through things, traumatic things, losing family, losing kids, losing bankruptcies, you name it, whatever the adversity is. I mean, that's the gift that we get coming to Alcoholics Anonymous, is not to hear people tell their problems or the things they're going through, but to see how they could stay sober through that stuff. And here I am, I'm coming out of a physical therapist's office, and the lady calls me, the hospice nurse calls me and says, your mom's going to die any minute, you better get here. And my brothers and sisters live all over the country. I'm the only one that's here in New Jersey. And I go to see my mom, and haven't seen her in about 6 months. And I think I'm going to walk in the room and find my 60-year-old mother. Well, that's how delusional I was. It was my 94-year-old mother, who I haven't seen in 6 months because everything was shut down in New Jersey. And my sisters are hitting me up FaceTime so we could talk to her. And when I met the hospice nurse, she gave me the COVID test, and I had to put the PPE on. And she said to me, your mom can't open her eyes, and your mom can't speak, but she could hear you. And when she pulled that curtain back, what I saw in the bed was a skeleton, my mother. And then I had that moment I've heard from a million podiums, that moment where I was able to sit with my mom in her last minutes, the last hours, and to hold her hand. And when I grabbed her hand, I said, hi, Mom, it's me, Jimmy. Her chest exploded with oxygen. She knew her son came to see her. And I talked about our lives together and how much I loved her, and thank her for, my mother bailed me out of every jail I was ever in. Matter of fact, when she was 90 years old, the dementia was so bad, we were having lunch right downstairs, me and my wife, and my mother looked at me and she said, Jimmy, where were you? I couldn't find you. I walked the streets for 2 years looking for my son. Where were you? And my mind was like, do I answer that? Because within the next 3 seconds, she didn't even know who I was. But I had that moment with her. And I was able to sit there. And that's the only reason why that happens, is because of Alcoholics Anonymous, and being able to recover from this thing that was killing me. You know, I got 30 seconds to go. I got very involved with service. I got very involved with, carrying a message. I went to a service assembly once and, I got hooked on that. And I don't have the time to tell you that whole story, but, I just rotated out as the delegate to New Jersey, the panel 71 delegate. And what an experience that was, being in Brooklyn, being with 93 other delegates, 135 people at the General Service Conference, talking about the things we talk about, doing the business of Alcoholics Anonymous. How does that happen? A kid from the streets to the conference and everything that's in between. Nothing more than God, Alcoholics Anonymous, good friendships, people of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the kindness of strangers. What a life. I'm so grateful for this. Thank you so much.